reporter and producer Nosipho Mncube attended the briefing held by the Labour and Employment Ministry in Durban this week and spoke to the International Labour Organization about the upcoming conference.
Now I'd like to bring in Dr. Joni Musabayana from the International Labour Organization just to speak to us about some of the numbers that he's been able to crunch with regards to the human trafficking as well as child labour taking place in the country as well as across the African continent. Very terrifying numbers that we've heard from you with regards to Africa being one of the continents that have the leading numbers or the most numbers with regards to child labour and child trafficking. And you did highlight that it presents itself differently in different countries. Are you able to give us the context within South Africa? What does it present itself as in the country?
Thank you. First, let's talk at the global level. Child labour had been declining over the past 15 years. Reflection that the global economy is picking up because child labour is directly related to the economic performance of countries. And however, since 2015, and much more so with the advent now of the COVID impact, child labour has started to pick up again. And the percentage increase is highest on the African continent. Of the increase from 152 million children working in hazardous work, 160 million by 2020, an increase of 8 million. Most of this, more than half of these are on the African continent. And on the African continent, the spread differs between Central Africa, largely conflict-driven, Southern Africa, largely commercially driven, working in agriculture, particularly pattern mining in the plantations, and West Africa, which is largely, let's say, in subsistence agriculture. So on the African continent, different sub-regions present different phases of child labour. All of it child labour, but if we want to tackle the problem of child labour, we need to analyze the root causes. And therefore, in the Southern Africa context, and in South Africa in particular, we need to look at commercial agriculture. This is probably one of the biggest drivers. But we also, as the Minister has referred to, also have the issue of forced of trafficking, cross-border and within the country, between different provinces. We also have situations of sexual exploitation of young children. So all of these need to be looked at, and the solutions depend on the major drivers of this type of child labor.
Has COVID in any way exacerbated the issue of child labour and trafficking? I'd imagine that over the past 2 years, people have taken a knock financially as well as their social lives and their income. Has it affected the numbers as well?
Absolutely. We are aware that despite the efforts of the government to ensure that the basic income grant was extended, the 350, the income relief grant was extended to everyone, not everybody managed to access it, particularly those in the informal economy. And we know that child labour during the COVID crisis increased because families were hard hit, their income levels declined, the relief measures did not necessarily always reach to everybody, and we ended up therefore with children not being able to go to school also because the schools were closed. So COVID has been a big driver of child labour, unfortunately.
Have you been able to identify other key drivers that, and as well as some of the stumbling blocks that may hinder progress in terms of trying to eradicate child labour? Because I've seen that there is that goal to reach or eradicate child labour by 2025. We are 3 years away from that. What are some of the stumbling blocks that you have been able to identify as the organisation?
I think a key issue is access to education, particularly for the girl child. The prevalence of schools, the proximity of schools, the ease with which children can go to school. But when they're at school, the importance of nutrition, so that children who are coming from disadvantaged families are going to school without having eaten anything, and therefore the importance of rolling out, deepening the food, the children feeding schemes at the schools. This is a major, let's say, a major effort to ameliorate the impact of child labour. But at the end of the day, the challenge is the economy. If the economy continues to grow at 1 or 2%, it means not many people are able to get into the economic activities. We know that the unemployment number is now at an all-time high of about 35%. And we know that particularly child-headed household or young people with children end up being impacted the most. The social income grant is trying to assist, the child grants are trying to assist, but unless the economy picks up and is able to provide economic activity for those who should work, that would ensure that children go to school. But when the economy does not perform well and is continuing to shed jobs, it then has a knock-on effect on the prevalence of child labor.
Dr. Joni, I'm curious to know, because we've discussed child labor in the form of, for instance, the soldiers, the child soldiers, those who'd be forced to work on farms. Curious to know about children that we have seen in child begging situations. That is something that's prevalent as well in South Africa. We see it on a lot of our roads. What can you touch on with regards to that, with regards to child labor as well and the eradication of child labor? Is that in itself a form of child labor as we see it on our streets, and how can we eradicate that? How do you think the South African government as well can work towards eradicating that, because it becomes more and more prevalent as time goes by?
Indeed, most of the streets, if you look carefully, you'll see that the children are with an adult who is sitting in the background and directing the child which cars to approach, and once they get given something, the children don't keep the money, they go and give it to the elder. So we can correctly say that is child labor. Remember again that the definition of child labor is not child work. Culturally, we need young people to work so that they become responsible adults. But when young people are forced to do commercial activity, income generating activity at the expense of going to school, then that becomes child labor. And then we have the worst forms of child labor, where children do work that is hazardous to their emotional, psychological and physiological well-being. And the children in the streets, I think, fit in the worst forms of child labor. As to the measures to address it, I think we have to say, as the Honorable Minister said, we need a holistic approach. What is driving these families to live on the streets? Is it accommodation? Is it lack of access to employment opportunities? Is it lack of access to the different grants that are being provided? And I do think the intersect between economic policy on the one hand and social policy on the other is particularly key. When the economy is not performing at the level as it should, then the social protection measures that are being put in place, particularly the debate around the basic income grant, become very, very critical in how to address child labor.
Thank you very much, Doctor. That's Dr. Joni Musabayana from the International Labour Organization, just detailing to us some of those numbers that they have been able to identify as an organization of child labor and human trafficking in South Africa, in the continent, as well as across the world. But more of that will be discussed during the conference scheduled to take place from the 15th to the 20th of May here in Durban.